During the beginning of World War I, the United States wanted to stay neutral during the war, but as Germany continued to attack American ships, the United States had no choice but to join the war. In April of 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. By the summer of 1918, 10,000 American soldiers were arriving in Europe every day. The United States made it illegal to speak against the war, and over 2,000 people were arrested for doing so. In November of 1918, the Allies won the war. The Treaty of Versailles was created to punish Germany. A couple months later, the Russian Empire saw a communist revolution, which instilled fears in the United States that communism would spread westward. During the Spanish flu, the United States lost about 550,000 people. After the war, the economy began to boom. African Americans witnessed their first cultural movement with music such as jazz. The Federal Bureau for Investigation was also created to tackle big domestic legal issues. One of their first big cases was with oil companies trying to buy the Oklahoma Territory from Native Americans so they could build up their own oil fields. Prohibition became a big issue during these times. As the government made alcohol illegal except for medical reasons, people began to secretly make and sell their own alcohol. This ended up with the creation of mafias, where they would have networks of people distributing alcohol without the government's knowledge. With prohibition being such a large failure, it was repealed not long after. While the economy was booming after the First World War, an overinflated stock market went from an economic resurgence into an expanding bubble. On October 29, 1929, the stock market crashed, kicking off the Great Depression. The economy saw deflation and unemployment soared from 3% to 25%. Farming product prices fell by 50%, and manufacturing output fell by about 33%. In response to this, FDR became president. He created a program called the New Deal. This deal created a large amount of social programs that would create jobs and pump a large amount of money into the economy. The New Deal also created Social Security, unemployment relief and insurance, public housing, bankruptcy insurance, farm subsidies, and regulation of financial securities. A permanent sales tax was created to make up the money lost from these programs. Labor unions were also created to protect workers. The issue of unemployment wasn't fixed until after the Second World War. As a revolution was underway in Mexico, over 400,000 Mexicans fled to the United States. Roosevelt stated that he would stay out of Mexican politics, and he did so by keeping federal troops away from the southern border. During the Great Depression, many democracies were overthrown with dictatorships as people became desperate for an end to the global depression. As Japan was taking over Asia and Germany and Italy threatened to take over Europe, Britain and France attempted to prevent another continental conflict by appeasing Germany. As America wanted to stay out of global politics, politicians and citizens became very uneasy when Germany kicked off their invasion of Poland. Roosevelt wanted to keep the United States out of the conflict, but he would let the Allied powers buy needed wartime equipment from the United States. As Japan was taking over Asia, they wanted to make sure the United States would not get into their way. By thinking that the United States would stay out of the war at all costs, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor to kick the United States out of the Pacific. In return, the United States declared war on the Axis powers and joined the Allied front. Roosevelt also forced over 120,000 Japanese Americans into internment camps due to his paranoia about the possible Japanese rebellion and support for the Pearl Harbor attacks. What he actually did was jail innocent people who left Japan due to its evils in a journey for freedom. Half of all the Japanese forced into internment camps were children. The economy boomed as the United States made one of its biggest focuses of the war to maximize exports to Allied nations. At this point in time, 40% of the economy was toward the war efforts in Europe and the Pacific. The quality of incomes were drastically increased, and as many workers had left to fight in the war, many women and African Americans were hired as replacements. This heavily benefited women and African Americans, as they were originally discriminated against from working good-paying jobs. In 1942, the Allies, or mostly America, was able to halt Japanese expansion within the Pacific. As Japan failed to take Alaska, the United States began island hopping. This was a strategy where the United States would take one island at a time, slowly hopping between islands until they would make it to the main Japanese island. The United States also helped the invasions of North Africa, where Axis territories were taken away, and the invasion of Italy was conducted. Halfway through Italy, Benito Mussolini was overthrown by the Italian people, and they joined the Allied powers. On June 6, 1944, the United States participated in the D-Day invasions of France. In 1945, Roosevelt died and was replaced by Vice President Harry Truman. Under Truman, the United States liberated France and Western Germany, while the Soviet Union liberated Eastern Europe, including Eastern Germany and Berlin. As the United States was slowly hopping its way towards Japan, the Manhattan Project was underway. This project was the United States' attempt at developing a nuclear bomb. On July 16, 1945, the United States successfully tested its first nuclear bomb. As the United States estimated that Japan could mobilize 5 to 6 million civilians as soldiers, the United States fears that they would have to kill millions of their own soldiers to defeat Japan. As an alternative, the United States decided to drop nuclear bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Some say this was a good decision due to it preventing millions of soldiers from getting killed, but others say it was terrible because it was the result of innocent people being killed. In the end, the United States was able to occupy Japan as they surrendered. As the World War was over, it was now up to the two remaining global superpowers to decide what to do with the Axis members. Now that World War II is over, the United States and Soviet Union were the two superpowers left. America permanently ended its isolationism by joining the United Nations. In 1947, the CIA was created to spy on foreign enemies. The United States now focused on helping Western Europe and Japan rebuild from the war. The United States also wanted to prevent said nations from adopting communist principles. The Truman Doctrine was adopted, and the United States began sending military and economic aid to Greece and Turkey. This was to win over their support and prevent them from turning communist. This also helped the United States build influence very close to the Soviet Union's borders. The United States weakened trade restrictions with Western nations to help better influence, but 10% of GDP went towards Western aid. On the other hand, the Soviet Union began to adopt harsher control over Eastern countries to prevent them from turning capitalist. As the United States wanted to protect Western Europe from Soviet aggression, the United States helped form the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO for short. In response, the Soviet Union created the Warsaw Pact. This pact was created for the Soviet Union to have a stronger military and political presence within Eastern Europe. After spying on the Manhattan Project in 1949, the Soviet Union was able to successfully test their first nuclear bomb. The threat of nuclear war was acknowledged by both sides and resulted in a new form of warfare. Instead of directly fighting, they would either peacefully negotiate with nations to try to gain their influence, participate in a civil war to try to get their preferred side to win and gain influence, or participate in wars between two countries and try to help one side win to spread influence. Senator Joseph McCarthy created McCarthyism. McCarthyism is when the United States government would investigate and attempt to arrest anyone in Hollywood or the United States government for being communist. It does need to be known that most people investigated had communist ideologies, but had no ties to the Soviet Union. This means that the United States was merely arresting people for believing in an economic policy rather than capitalism. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientist who spearheaded the creation of the nuclear bomb, was even arrested because his wife was communist, even though he didn't care about politics. McCarthy also believed that gay people were communist. Eisenhower helped end the Korean War and cut the federal budget. He also helped create the interstate highway system. After Stalin died, Eisenhower tried to better relations with the Soviet Union to prevent the Cold War from getting hot. Before the Great Depression, only 31% of Americans were part of the middle class. After World War II, the economy boomed and 60% of Americans were now part of the middle class. As the cost of living was very affordable, people were easily able to have children. This is what created the baby boom, where population growth in the United States exploded. Segregation was a big issue during this new time. Segregation was ruled illegal by the Supreme Court. In Arkansas, Little Rock High School threatened black students for attempting to attend the high school, but Eisenhower sent down federal troops to ensure that these children would get equal education. Segregation and racism in the South, which was left over from the Civil War, was a main target for civil rights activists such as Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. Even though they had faced violent backlash, they continued their activism. Eventually, it paid off when more and more forms of segregation became illegal. In 1957, the space race began when the Soviet Union launched their Sputnik satellite into space. In 1958, Eisenhower created NASA, which then launched its first satellite that year. In 1969, the United States was able to put people on the moon. This is where the United States was easily able to declare itself the victor of the space race. After Lyndon B. Johnson was elected president, he created the Great Society programs, which helped end segregation once and for all. Native American Cesar Chavez helped great farmers create strikes and created the first farmers' union. This was done because he felt the United States government was not treating Native Americans fairly. Feminism and the environmental movement became popular as many young Americans were creating a counterculture as a backlash against the Vietnam War. As many riots were conducted by activists, peace was made when the government decided that both men and women could be legally treated equally. Today, abortion and gay rights are still ongoing arguments from this era. Richard Nixon helped end the Vietnam War and pinned Communist China against the Soviet Union. But as Nixon was caught spying on political opponents, he was forced to resign. This helped create strong distrust within the federal government. Jimmy Carter ended up becoming president due to the unpopularity of the Republican Party in Watergate. Even though Carter was able to bring peace between Egypt and Israel, he was not able to handle the Iran hostage crisis and the failing economy. Due to Carter's unpopularity, Ronald Reagan was able to become president. Minutes after his inauguration, he was able to free the hostages in Iran. When Ronald Reagan became president, he decreased the highest taxes from 78% to 28%. Some programs started under the New Deal and Great Societies ended to cut the budget in order to lower taxes. There was a short recession in 1982 due to high inflation created by the Carter administration, but after the recession ended due to lower inflation, unemployment was able to decrease. The economic growth also jumped from 4.5% to 7.2% in just 2 years. As the war on drugs was going on, Reagan created harsher laws against drug users. The amount of people arrested for drug-related crimes jumped from 50,000 people to 400,000 people, but information that was highly needed for AIDS medication was banned by the government. Reagan built up the military to outweigh the Soviet Union's influence. The United States began to build up its nuclear supply. The Soviet Union reacted by creating more nuclear missiles itself. In the late 80s, though, both the United States and Soviet Union agreed to end its nuclear buildup. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed due to its failing economy. After nearly 5 decades, the Cold War was finally over, but the end of the Cold War did not end the spread of United States influence. The United States continued to get involved in small wars across the world in hopes to spread their influence. The economy continued to boom as the newly created internet was quickly beginning to connect the world. In 2000, the dot-com bubble popped, creating a short economic panic. After the September 11th attacks, the United States and NATO started the War on Terror. A housing market crisis, subprime mortgage crisis, soaring oil prices, and automotive industry crisis, and rising unemployment ended up causing the Great Recession. Under the Obama administration, gay marriage was legalized and government-funded Medicare was drastically increased. But due to slow recovery, people believed that Obama was not good for the economy. In retaliation, Trump was able to win the 2016 election. As the economy began to boom again, it was quickly cut off by the COVID-19 lockdowns. These lockdowns crippled the economy and created the shortest recession in American history. With people being unhappy with Trump's response to COVID-19, Biden was able to win the 2020 election. I'd like to explain everything that went on between 2020 and today, but we all have lived through it. It also saves me a lot of time not having to explain the last 4 years. But a few things should be noted for the topic of the video. Like I explained in episode 1, the Disinformation Governance Board was created. This was one of the many examples of the United States government attempting to control speech on the internet. But I suggest you watch episode 1 if you want more details on that. Originally, the Native Americans that we know today were actually settlers themselves at one point. They traveled from Asia to North America. They created their own traditions and continued to hunt and gather the way they did in Asia. As they moved south towards South America, they began to build civilizations where they would worship their gods. They created oppression amongst themselves as they practiced slavery and human sacrifice. As the natives were no longer settlers but now considered native to the area, they began to construct economies and governments. As this was happening, Europe had discovered the Americas and were now creating settlements of their own. But as natives made up most of the land in the Americas, the Europeans had to buy land from the natives or go to war to take the land. As the Europeans were oppressing the natives to get their way, European culture was less oppressive than the native cultures. The European settlers felt as if they were being oppressed by their governments. In response, they declared independence. After winning the War of Independence, the new North American colonies had to make a government of their own. So they created the United States of America and founded it on liberty and equality, though this liberty and equality only favored white men. But because the government was too small to support itself, it was quickly expanded to handle a larger military, economy, and tax systems. As the population grew, the United States expanded its territory west in order to make more room for farmers. In the process, the United States military was used to move or eradicate Native Americans living on future farmland. But as time progressed, the American people were becoming more and more progressive. People in the North were becoming fed up with slavery, while farmers in the South wanted to keep their cheap labor. As Abraham Lincoln became president of the United States, the Southern states revolted by leaving the nation. Lincoln was able to lead the United States into victory, and equality within America was strengthened. This was done by banning slavery, banning the ability to deny citizenship based on race, and allowing minorities to vote, as government officials and monopolies were becoming more and more corrupt. The people created labor unions to protect themselves. They also began electing politicians that would ban monopolies and go after corrupt politicians. But in the end, corruption grew too strong to defeat. Both World Wars and the Great Depression saw a rapidly expanding government. This was done by expanding funding for social programs in the military. It is believed that the government spent so much on social programs that it actually extended the Great Depression longer than it would have been. During the Cold War, America saw many changes. Equality for minorities was greatly expanded, giving them the same rights white men had. Women were also given the same rights as men, such as the right to vote. But the government was beginning to start what we know as the crackdown on privacy. The CIA was created to spy on America's enemies, while the FBI was created to spy on anyone who seemed to be communist. The government targeted any Hollywood members for being communist, even though they had no ties to the Soviet Union. As the Cold War ended, the War on Terror began just a decade later. As the War on Terror raged on, the government created programs to spy on all American citizens. Today, the government has made many attempts to pressure social media companies to censor information they don't like. First, they did this privately, and then they created the Disinformation Governance Board. This organization was created to force social media companies to delete posts they didn't like and ban anyone they disagreed with. Due to public backlash, this organization was quickly shut down. But even though the organization was shut down, many politicians were still trying to get the government to censor people on the internet. So how can we prevent the United States from becoming more oppressive? The main thing to do is to recognize what the Founding Fathers' intentions for creating the country were. Our nation was created to prevent a large government from overtaxing us, violating our privacy, restricting liberty and equality, and criminalizing opposition. What we can do is vote for politicians who understand these values and are willing to throw away populism if it means shrinking the government and giving liberty back to the people. And if there's nobody with those values on the ticket, then maybe you should share those values. You should lead the United States back into a free and fair society. I want to thank you for watching this episode. If you think I got something wrong, let me know in the comments. If you want me to look into a specific topic, also let me know in the comments. Subscribe if you enjoy this kind of long-form content. Subscribe to my Clips channel if you prefer to watch shorter segmented forms of this podcast. And finally, subscribe to my Shorts channel if you only want to hear my most informative quotes. Links to all my channels are in the description. Links to all my sources are also in the description. The next podcast will be about the book Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. So stay tuned for that. Anyways, I'll see you next time.